Alright. We're live. Let me link this out. Alright, so, today we're starting Chamber of Secrets. This is, the second book in the Harry Potter series, and, I personally like this one more than the first one, and, yeah, I guess before we start, I'd like to somehow cast out some kind of positive aura and I hope that this stream can bring some good. All right. Not sure if I'm jumping right in or if I should wait a little bit for people to show up. But yeah. I guess I might just start shortly. Maybe some quick recap of Sorcerer's Stone. Harry as a baby somehow couldn't be killed by the Dark Lord Voldemort. The curse backfired when Harry was just a baby. And Harry became famous for this because the Dark Lord was like terrorizing everyone. And then the Dark Lord kind of disappeared after that. And Harry was sent to live with his Muggle relatives, non-magic relatives who knew about magic but hated magic. And Harry spent like 11 years not knowing. Then finally met Hagrid, who told him that he was a wizard and that he could come to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. And it felt like a dream that was too good to be true, but then he woke up and that was actually happening. And so he went and got all his stuff, ended up on the train, met some people, ended up becoming friends with Ron and Hermione Granger, got sorted into Gryffindor House at Hogwarts, and went through all sorts of lessons, classes. There's a character named Draco Malfoy who's sort of like a bit of an antagonist. There's also a teacher, Snape, who also seems to be kind of an antagonist. But they had some run-ins with various things and started to uncover a secret about something called the Sorcerer's Stone or the Philosopher's Stone that was being guarded somewhere in the school, and they worked their way through it, found out that someone was potentially trying to steal it, and ended up in a confrontation, going through all of these different magical kind of enchantments and protections, getting all the way to the end. And Harry found out that it was Professor Quirrell who was trying to steal the stone, and that Voldemort was residing on Quirrell's body in the back of his turban. And Harry kind of barely prevented the stone from being taken, although maybe well, it kind of barely prevented it. Not sure how the Mirror of Erised would have lasted if Harry wasn't there. And things ended up okay. Dumbledore told Harry that Harry's father had saved Snape's life back when they were back at school, and that this is why. Well, I don't know. Anyway, the year ended. Harry goes back to his Muggle relatives for the summer before beginning his next year. And here's where we begin. Chapter 1. The Worst Birthday. Don't know. Chapter 1. The Worst Birthday. Not for the first time, an argument had broken out over breakfast at number 4 Privet Drive. Mr. Vernon Dursley had been woken in the early hours of the morning by a loud hooting noise from his nephew Harry's room. "Third time this week," he roared across the table. "If you can't control that owl, it'll have to go." Harry tried yet again to explain. "She's bored," he said. "She's used to flying around outside. If I could just let her out at night." "Do I look stupid?" snarled Uncle Vernon, a bit of fried egg dangling from his bushy mustache. "I know what'll happen if that owl's let out." He exchanged dark looks with his wife, Petunia. Harry tried to argue back, but his words were drowned by a long, loud belch from the Dursleys' son, Dudley. "I want more bacon." "There's more in the frying pan, sweetums," said Aunt Petunia, turning misty eyes on her massive son. "We must build you up while we've got the chance. I don't like the sound of that school food." "Nonsense, Petunia. I never went hungry when I was at Smeltings," said Uncle Vernon heartily. "Dudley gets enough, don't you, son?" Dudley, who was so large his bottom drooped out over either side of the kitchen chair, grinned and turned to Harry. "Pass the frying pan." "You've forgotten the magic word," said Harry irritably. The effect of this simple sentence on the rest of the family was incredible. Dudley gasped and fell off his chair with a crash that shook the whole kitchen. Mrs. Dursley gave a small scream and clapped her hands to her mouth. Mr. Dursley jumped to his feet, veins throbbing in his temples. "I meant please," said Harry quickly. "I didn't mean—" "What if I told you," thundered his uncle, spraying spit all over the table, "about saying the M word in our house?" "But I—" "How dare you threaten Dudley?" roared Uncle Vernon, pounding the table with his fist. I warned you. I will not tolerate mention of your abnormality under this roof." Harry stared from his purple-faced uncle to his pale aunt, who was trying to heave Dudley to his feet. "All right," said Harry. "All right." Uncle Vernon sat back down, breathing like a winded rhinoceros, and watching Harry closely out of the corners of his small, sharp eyes. Ever since Harry had come home for the summer holidays, Uncle Vernon had been treating him like a bomb that might go off at any moment, because Harry Potter wasn't a normal boy. As a matter of fact, he was as not normal as it is possible to be. Harry Potter was a wizard fresh from his first year at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and if the Dursleys were unhappy to have him back for the holidays, it was nothing to how Harry felt. He missed Hogwarts so much it was like having a constant stomach ache. He missed the castle with its secret passageways and ghosts, his classes, though perhaps not Snape, the potions master, the mail arriving by owl, eating banquets in the Great Hall, sleeping in his four-poster bed in the Tower dormitory, visiting the gamekeeper, Hagrid, in his cabin next to the Forbidden Forest in the grounds, and, especially, Quidditch, the most popular sport in the wizarding world. 6 tall goalposts, 4 flying balls, and 14 players on broomsticks. All Harry's spellbooks, his wand, robes, cauldron, and top-of-the-line Nimbus 2000 broomstick, had been locked in a cupboard under the stairs by Uncle Vernon the instant Harry had come home. What did the Dursleys care if Harry lost his place on the house Quidditch team because he hadn't practiced all summer? What was it to the Dursleys if Harry went back to school without any of his homework done? The Dursleys were what wizards called muggles, not a drop of magical blood in their veins. And as far as they were concerned, having a wizard in the family was a matter of deepest shame. Uncle Vernon had even padlocked Harry's owl, Hedwig, inside her cage to stop her from carrying messages to anyone in the wizarding world. Harry looked nothing like the rest of the family. Uncle Vernon was large and neckless, with an enormous black mustache. Aunt Petunia was horse-faced and bony. Dudley was blonde, pink, and porky. Harry, on the other hand, was small and skinny, with brilliant green eyes and jet-black hair that was always untidy. He wore round glasses, and on his forehead was a thin, lightning-shaped scar. It was this scar that made Harry so particularly unusual, even for a wizard. This scar was the only hint of Harry's very mysterious past, of the reason he had been left on the Dursleys' doorstep 11 years before. At the age of 1 year old, Harry had somehow survived a curse from the greatest dark sorcerer of all time, Lord Voldemort, whose name most witches and wizards still feared to speak. Harry's parents had died in Voldemort's attack, but Harry had escaped with his lightning scar, and somehow, nobody understood why, Voldemort's powers had been destroyed the instant he had failed to kill Harry. So Harry had been brought up by his dead mother's sister and her husband. He had spent 10 years with the Dursleys, never understanding why he kept making odd things happen without meaning to, believing the Dursley story that he had got his scar in the car crash that had killed his parents. And then, exactly a year ago, Hogwarts had written to Harry, and the whole story had come out. Harry had taken up his place at wizard school, where he and his scar were famous. But now the school year was over, and he was back with the Dursleys for the summer, back to being treated like a dog that had rolled in something smelly. The Dursleys hadn't even remembered that today happened to be Harry's 12th birthday. Of course, his hopes hadn't been high. They'd never given him a real present, let alone a cake, but to ignore it completely. At that moment, Uncle Vernon cleared his throat importantly and said, "Now, as we all know, today is a very important day." Harry looked up, hardly daring to believe it. "This could well be the day I make the biggest deal of my career," said Uncle Vernon. Harry went back to his toast. Of course, he thought bitterly. Uncle Vernon was talking about the stupid dinner party. He'd been talking of nothing else for 2 weeks. Some rich builder and his wife were coming to dinner, and Uncle Vernon was hoping to get a huge order from him. Uncle Vernon's company made drills. "I think we should run through the schedule one more time," said Uncle Vernon. "We should all be in position at 8 o'clock. Petunia, you will be in the lounge," said Aunt Petunia promptly, waiting to welcome them graciously to our home. "Good, good. And Dudley? I'll be waiting to open the door." Dudley put on a foul, simpering smile. "May I take your coats, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" "They'll love him," cried Aunt Petunia rapturously. "Excellent, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon. Then he rounded on Harry. "And you?" "I'll be in my bedroom, making no noise and pretending I'm not there," said Harry tonelessly. "Exactly," said Uncle Vernon nastily. "I will lead them into the lounge, introduce you, Petunia, and pour them drinks. At 8:15, I'll announce dinner," said Aunt Petunia. "And Dudley, you'll say..." "May I take you through to the dining room, Mrs. Mason?" said Dudley, offering his fat arm to an invisible person. "My perfect little gentleman," sniffed Aunt Petunia. "And you," said Uncle Vernon viciously to Harry. "I'll be in my room, making no noise and pretending I'm not there," said Harry dully. "Precisely. Now, we should aim to get in a few good compliments at dinner. Petunia, any ideas?" "Vernon tells me you're a wonderful golfer, Mr. Mason. Do tell me where you bought your dress, Mrs. Mason." "Perfect. Dudley? How about, we had to write an essay about our hero at school, Mr. Mason, and I wrote about you." This was too much for both Aunt Petunia and Harry. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and hugged her son while Harry ducked under the table so they wouldn't see him laughing. "And you, boy." Harry fought to keep his face straight as he emerged. "I'll be in my room, making no noise and pretending I'm not there," he said. "Too right you will," said Uncle Vernon forcefully. "The Masons don't know anything about you, and it's going to stay that way. When dinner's over, you take Mrs. Mason back to the lounge for coffee, Petunia, and I'll bring the subject around to drills. With any luck, I'll have the deal signed and sealed before the news at 10. We'll be shopping for a vacation home in Majorca this time tomorrow." Harry couldn't feel too excited about this. He didn't think the Dursleys would like him any better in, is it Majorca or Majorca? Majorca than they did in Privet Drive. "Right, I'm off into town to pick up dinner jackets for Dudley and me. And you," he snarled at Harry, "you stay out of your aunt's way while she's cleaning." Harry left through the back door. It was a brilliant, sunny day. He crossed the lawn, slumped down on the garden bench, and sang out under his breath, "Happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me." No cards, no presents, and he would be spending the evening pretending not to exist. He gazed miserably into the hedge. He had never felt so lonely. More than anything else at Hogwarts, more than even playing Quidditch, Harry missed his best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger. They, however, didn't seem to be missing him at all. Neither of them had written to him all summer, even though Ron had said he was going to ask Harry to come and stay. Countless times, Harry had been on the point of unlocking Hedwig's cage by magic and sending her to Ron and Hermione with a letter, but it wasn't worth the risk. Underage wizards weren't allowed to use magic outside of school. Harry hadn't told the Dursleys this. He knew it was only their terror that he might turn them all into dung beetles that stopped them from locking him in the cupboard under the stairs with his wand and broomstick. For the first couple of weeks back, Harry had enjoyed muttering nonsense words under his breath and watching Dudley tearing out of the room as fast as his fat legs would carry him. But the long silence from Ron and Hermione had made Harry feel so cut off from the magical world that even taunting Dudley had lost its appeal. And now Ron and Hermione had forgotten his birthday. What wouldn't he give now for a message from Hogwarts? From any witch or wizard? He'd almost be glad of a sight of his arch enemy, Draco Malfoy, just to make sure it hadn't all been a dream. Not that his whole year at Hogwarts had been fun. At the very end of last term, Harry had come face to face with none other than Lord Voldemort himself. Voldemort might be a ruin of his former self, but he was still terrifying, still cunning, still determined to regain power. Harry had slipped through Voldemort's clutches for a second time, but it had been a narrow escape. And even now, weeks later, Harry kept walking in the night, drenched in cold sweat, wondering where Voldemort was now, remembering his livid face, his wide, mad eyes. Harry suddenly sat bolt upright on the garden bench. He had been staring absent-mindedly into the hedge, and the hedge was staring back. Two enormous green eyes had appeared amongst the leaves. Harry jumped to his feet just as a jeering voice floated across the lawn. "I know what day it is," sang Dudley, waddling toward him. The huge eyes blinked and vanished. "What?" said Harry, not taking his eyes off the spot where they had been. "I know what day it is," Dudley repeated, coming right up to him. "Well done," said Harry. "So you finally learned the days of the week." "Today's your birthday," sneered Dudley. "How come you haven't got any cards? Haven't you even got friends at that freak place?" "Better not let your mom hear you talking about my school," said Harry coolly. Dudley hitched up his trousers, which were slipping down his fat bottom. "Why are you staring at the hedge?" he said suspiciously. "I'm trying to decide what would be the best spell to set it on fire," said Harry. Dudley stumbled backward at once, a look of panic on his fat face. "You can't. Dad told me you're not to do magic. He said he'll chuck you out of the house, and you haven't got anywhere else to go. You haven't got any friends to take you." "Jiggery pokery," said Harry in a fierce voice. "Hocus pocus, squiggly wiggly." "Mom!" howled Dudley, tripping over his feet as he dashed back towards the house. "Mom! He's doing you-know-what." Harry paid dearly for his moment of fun. As neither Dudley nor the hedge was hurt in any way, Aunt Petunia knew he hadn't really done magic, but he still had to duck as she aimed a heavy blow at his head with a soapy frying pan. Then she gave him work to do, with the promise he wouldn't eat again until he'd finished. While Dudley lolled around watching and eating ice cream, Harry cleaned the windows, washed the car, mowed the lawn, trimmed the flower beds, pruned and watered the roses, and repainted the garden bench. The sun blazed overhead, burning the back of his neck. Harry knew he shouldn't have risen to Dudley's bait, but Dudley had said the very thing Harry had been thinking about himself. Maybe he didn't have any friends at Hogwarts. Wish they could see the famous Harry Potter now, he thought savagely as he spread manure on the flower beds, his back aching, sweat running down his face. It was 7:30 in the evening when, at last, exhausted, he heard Aunt Petunia calling him. "Get in here and walk on the newspaper." Harry moved gladly into the shade of the gleaming kitchen. On the top of the fridge stood tonight's pudding, a huge mound of whipped cream and sugared violets. A loin of pork roast was sizzling in the oven. "Eat quickly, the Masons will be here soon," snapped Aunt Petunia, pointing to 2 slices of bread and a lump of cheese on the kitchen table. She was already wearing a salmon pink cocktail dress. Harry washed his hands and bolted down his pitiful supper. The moment he had finished, Aunt Petunia whisked away his plate. "Upstairs, hurry!" And he passed the door to the living room. Harry caught a glimpse of Uncle Vernon and Dudley in bow ties and dinner jackets. He had only just reached the upstairs landing when the doorbell rang and Uncle Vernon's furious face appeared at the foot of the stairs. "Remember, boy, one sound." Harry crossed to his bedroom on tiptoe, slipped inside, closed the door, and turned to collapse on his bed. The trouble was, there was already someone sitting on it. End of chapter 1. All right. Let's jump into chapter 2. Chapter 2 is Dobby's Warning. Chapter 2, Dobby's Warning. Harry had managed not to shout out, but it was a close thing. The little creature on the bed had large, bat-like ears and bulging green eyes the size of tennis balls. Harry knew instinctively that this was what had been watching him out of the garden hedge this morning. As they stared at each other, Harry heard Dudley's voice from the hall. "May I take your coats, Mr. and Mrs. Mason?" The creature slipped off the bed and bowed so low that the end of its long, thin nose touched the carpet. Harry noticed that it was wearing what looked like an old pillowcase with rips for arm and leg holes. Hello," said Harry nervously. "Harry Potter," said the creature in a high-pitched voice Harry was sure would carry down the stairs. "So long has Dobby wanted to meet you, sir. Such an honor it is." "Thank you," said Harry, edging along the wall and sinking into his desk chair next to Hedwig, who was asleep in her large cage. He wanted to ask, "What are you?" but thought it would sound too rude, so instead he said, "Who are you?" "Dobby, sir, just Dobby. Dobby the house elf," said the creature. "Oh, really?" said Harry. I don't want to be rude or anything, but this isn't a great time for me to have a house elf in my bedroom." Aunt Petunia's high, false laugh sounded from the living room. The elf hung his head. "Not that I'm not pleased to meet you," said Harry quickly, "but, is there any reason that you're here?" "Oh, yes, sir," said Dobby earnestly. "Dobby has come to tell you, sir. It is difficult, sir. Dobby wonders where to begin." "Sit down," said Harry politely, pointing at the bed. To his horror, the elf burst into tears, very noisy tears. "Sit down," he wailed. "Never, never, ever." Harry thought he heard the voices downstairs falter. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to offend you or anything." "Offend Dobby?" choked the elf. Dobby had never been asked to sit down by a wizard, like an equal. Harry was trying to say, "Shh," and look comforting at the same time. Ushered Dobby back onto the bed, where he sat hiccoughing, looking like a large and very ugly doll. At last he managed to control himself, and sat with his green eyes fixed on Harry, an expression of watery adoration. "You can't have met many decent wizards," said Harry, trying to cheer him up. Dobby shook his head. Then, without warning, he leapt up and started banging his head furiously on the window, shouting, "Bad Dobby! Bad Dobby!" "Don't! What are you doing?" Harry hissed, springing up and pulling Dobby back onto the bed. Hedwig had woken up with a particularly loud screech and was beating her wings wildly against the bars of her cage. "Dobby had to punish himself, sir," said the elf, who had gone slightly cross-eyed. "Dobby almost spoke ill of his family, sir." "Your family?" "The wizard family Dobby serves, sir. Dobby is a house elf, bound to serve one house and one family forever." "Do they know that you're here?" asked Harry curiously. Dobby shuddered. "Oh no, sir, no. Dobby will have to punish himself most grievously for coming to see you, sir. Dobby will have to shut his ears in the oven door for this, if they ever knew, sir." "But won't they notice if you shut your ears in the oven door?" "Dobby doubts it, sir. Dobby is always having to punish himself for something, sir. They lets Dobby get on with it, sir. Sometimes they reminds me to do extra punishments." "But why don't you leave? Escape?" "A house elf must be set free, sir, and the family will never set Dobby free. Dobby will serve the family until he dies, sir." Harry stared. "And I thought I had it bad staying here for another 4 weeks," he said. "This makes the Dursleys sound almost human. Can't anyone help you? Can't I?" Almost at once, Harry wished he hadn't spoken. Dobby dissolved again into wails of gratitude. "Please," Harry whispered frantically, "please be quiet. If the Dursleys hear anything, if they know you're here..." Harry Potter asks if he can help Dobby. "Dobby has heard of your greatness, sir, but of your goodness, Dobby never knew." Harry, who was feeling distinctly hot in the face, said, "Whatever you've heard about my greatness is a load of rubbish. I'm not even top a year at Hogwarts. That's Hermione. She..." But he stopped quickly, because thinking about Hermione was painful. "Harry Potter is humble and modest," said Dobby reverently, his orb-like eyes aglow. "Harry Potter speaks not of his triumph over he who must not be named." "Voldemort," said Harry. Dobby clapped his hands over his bat ears and moaned, "Ah, speak not the name, sir, speak not the name." "Sorry," said Harry quickly. "I know lots of people don't like it. My friend Ron..." He stopped again. Thinking about Ron was painful too. Dobby leaned forward towards Harry, his eyes wide as headlights. "Dobby heard tell," he said hoarsely, "that Harry Potter met the Dark Lord for a second time just weeks ago, that Harry Potter escaped yet again." Harry nodded, and Dobby's eyes suddenly shone with tears. "Ah, sir," he gasped, dabbing his face with the corner of the grubby pillowcase he was wearing. "Harry Potter is valiant and bold. He has survived so many dangers already. But Dobby has come to protect Harry Potter, to warn him. Even if he does have to shut his ears in the oven door later, Harry Potter must not go back to Hogwarts." There was a silence, broken only by the chink of knives and forks from downstairs and the distant rumble of Uncle Vernon's voice. "What?" Harry stammered. "But I've got to go back. Term starts on September 1st. It's all that's keeping me going. You don't know what it's like here. I don't belong here. I belong in your world, at Hogwarts." "No, no, no," squeaked Dobby, shaking his head so hard his ears flapped. "Harry Potter must stay where he is safe. He is too great, too good to lose. If Harry Potter goes back to Hogwarts, he will be in mortal danger." "Why?" said Harry in surprise. "There is a plot, Harry Potter. A plot to make the most terrible things happen at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry this year," whispered Dobby, suddenly trembling all over. "Dobby has known it for months, sir. Harry Potter must not put himself in peril. He is too important, sir. What terrible things? Said Harry at once. Who's plotting them? Dobby made a funny choking noise, then he banged his head frantically against the wall. All right, cried Harry, grabbing the elf's arm to stop him. You can't tell me, I understand. But why are you warning me? A sudden, unpleasant thought struck him. Hang on, this hasn't got anything to do with you-know-who, has it? You could just shake or nod, he added hastily as Dobby's head tilted worryingly close to the wall again. Slowly, Dobby shook his head. Not he who must not be named, sir. But Dobby's eyes were wide, and he seemed to be trying to give Harry a hint. Harry, however, was completely lost. He hasn't got a brother, has he? Dobby shook his head, his eyes wider than ever. Well then, I can't think who else would want to have a chance of making horrible things happen at Hogwarts, said Harry. I mean, there's Dumbledore, for one thing. You know who Dumbledore is, don't you? Dobby bowed his head. Albus Dumbledore is the greatest headmaster Hogwarts ever had. Dobby knows it, sir. Dobby has heard Dumbledore's powers rival those of he who must not be named at the height of his strength. But, sir, Dobby's voice dropped to an urgent whisper, there are powers Dumbledore doesn't. Powers no decent wizard. And before Harry could stop him, Dobby bounded off the bed, seized Harry's desk lamp, and started beating himself around the head with ear-splitting yelps. A sudden silence fell downstairs. 2 seconds later, Harry, heart thudding madly, heard Uncle Vernon coming into the hall, calling, Dudley must have left his television on again, the little tyke. Quick, in the closet, hissed Harry, stuffing Dobby in, shutting the door and flinging himself onto the bed, just as the door handle turned. What the devil are you doing? Said Uncle Vernon through gritted teeth, his face horribly close to Harry's. You just ruined the punchline of my Japanese golfer joke. One more sound and you'll wish you'd never been born, boy. He stomped flat-footed from the room. Shaking, Harry let Dobby out of the closet. See what it's like here, he said. See why I have to go back to Hogwarts. It's the only place I've got. Well, I think I've got friends. Friends who don't even write to Harry Potter, said Dobby slyly. I expect they've just been... Wait a minute, said Harry, frowning. How do you know my friends haven't been writing to me? Dobby shuffled his feet. Harry Potter mustn't be angry with Dobby. Dobby did it for the best. Have you been stopping my letters? Dobby has them here, sir, said the elf. Stepping nimbly out of Harry's reach, he pulled a thick wad of envelopes from the inside of the pillowcase he was wearing. Harry could make out Hermione's neat writing, Ron's untidy scrawl, and even a scribble that looked as though it was from the Hogwarts gamekeeper, Hagrid. Dobby blinked anxiously up at Harry. Harry Potter mustn't be angry. Dobby hoped, if Harry Potter thought his friends had forgotten him, Harry Potter might not want to go back to school, sir. Harry wasn't listening. He made a grab for the letters, but Dobby jumped out of reach. Harry Potter will have them, sir, if he gives Dobby his word that he will not return to Hogwarts. Ah, sir, this is a danger you must not face. Say you won't go back, sir. No, said Harry angrily. Give me my friend's letters. Then Harry Potter leaves Dobby no choice, said the elf sadly. Before Harry could move, Dobby had darted to the bedroom door, pulled it open, and sprinted down the stairs. Mouth dry, stomach lurching, Harry sprung after him, trying not to make a sound. He jumped the last 6 steps, landing cat-like on the hall carpet, looking around for Dobby. From the dining room, he heard Uncle Vernon saying, Tell Petunia that very funny story about those American plumbers, Mr. Mason. She's been dying to hear. Harry ran up the hall into the kitchen and felt his stomach disappear. On Petunia's masterpiece of a pudding, the mountain of cream and sugared violets, was floating up near the ceiling. On top of a cupboard in the corner crouched Dobby. No, croaked Harry. Please, they'll kill me. Harry Potter must say he's not going back to school. Dobby, please. Say it, sir. I can't. Dobby gave him a tragic look. Then Dobby must do it, sir, for Harry Potter's own good. The pudding fell to the floor with a heart-stopping crash. Cream splattered the windows and walls as the dish shattered. With a crack like a whip, Dobby vanished. There were screams from the dining room, and Uncle Vernon burst into the kitchen to find Harry, rigid with shock, covered from head to foot in Aunt Petunia's pudding. At first, it looked as though Uncle Vernon would manage to gloss the whole thing over. Just our nephew, very disturbed. Meeting strangers upsets him, so we kept him upstairs. He shooed the shocked Masons back into the dining room, promised Harry he would flay him to within an inch of his life when the Masons had left, and handed him a mop. Aunt Petunia dug some ice cream out of the freezer, and Harry, still shaking, started scrubbing the kitchen clean. Uncle Vernon might still have been able to make his deal if it hadn't been for the owl. Aunt Petunia was just passing around a box of after-dinner mints when a huge barn owl swooped through the dining room window, dropped a letter on Mrs. Mason's head, and swooped out again. Mrs. Mason screamed like a banshee and ran from the house, shouting about lunatics. Mr. Mason stayed just long enough to tell the Dursleys that his wife was mortally afraid of birds of all shapes and sizes, and to ask whether this was their idea of a joke. Harry stood in the kitchen, clutching the mop for support as Uncle Vernon advanced on him, a demonic glint in his tiny eyes. "Read it," he hissed evilly, brandishing the letter the owl had delivered. "Go on, read it." Harry took it. It did not contain birthday greetings. "Dear Mr. Potter, we have received intelligence that a hover charm was used at your place of residence this evening at 12 minutes past 9. As you know, underage wizards are not permitted to perform spells outside of school, and further spell work on your part may lead to expulsion from said school. Decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, 1875, paragraph C. We would also ask you to remember that any magical activity that risks notice by members of the non-magical community, Muggles, is a serious offense under Section 13 of the International Confederation of Warlocks Statute of Secrecy. Enjoy your holidays. Yours sincerely, Mafalda Hopkirk, Improper Use of Magic Office, Ministry of Magic." Harry looked up from the letter and gulped. "You didn't tell us you weren't allowed to use magic outside of school," said Uncle Vernon, a mad gleam dancing in his eyes. "Forgot to mention it. Slipped your mind, I dare say." He was bearing down on Harry like a great bulldog, all his teeth bared. "Well, I've got news for you, boy. I'm locking you up. You'll never going back to that school, never. And if you try and magic yourself out, they'll expel you." And, laughing like a maniac, he dragged Harry back upstairs. Uncle Vernon was as bad as his word. The following morning, he paid a man to fit bars on Harry's window. He himself fitted a cat flap in the bedroom door so that small amounts of food could be pushed inside 3 times a day. They let Harry out to use the bathroom morning and evening. Otherwise, he was locked in his room around the clock. 3 days later, the Dursleys were showing no signs of relenting, and Harry couldn't see any way out of his situation. He lay on his bed watching the sun sinking behind the bars on the window, and wondered miserably what was going to happen to him. What was the good of magicking himself out of his room if Hogwarts would expel him for doing it? Yet life at Privet Drive had reached an all-time low. Now that the Dursleys knew they weren't going to wake up as fruit bats, he had lost his only weapon. Dobby might have saved Harry from horrible happenings at Hogwarts, but the way things were going, he'd probably starve to death anyway. The cat flap rattled, and Aunt Petunia's hand appeared, pushing a bowl of canned soup into the room. Harry, whose insides were aching with hunger, jumped off his bed and seized it. The soup was stone cold, but he drank half of it in one gulp. Then he crossed the room to Hedwig's cage and tipped the soggy vegetables at the bottom of the bowl into her empty food tray. She ruffled her feathers and gave him only a look of deep disgust. "It's no good turning your beak at it. It's all we've got," said Harry grimly. He put the empty bowl back on the floor next to the cat flap and lay back down on his bed, somehow even hungrier than he had been before the soup. Supposing he was still alive in another 4 weeks, what would happen if he didn't turn up at Hogwarts? Would someone be sent to see why he hadn't come back? Would they be able to make the Dursleys let him go? The room was growing dark. Exhausted, stomach rumbling, mind spinning over the same unanswerable questions, Harry fell into an uneasy sleep. He dreamed that he was on a show in a zoo with a card reading "Underage Wizard" attached to his cage. People goggled through the bars at him as he lay, starving and weak, on a bed of straw. He saw Dobby's face in the crowd and shouted out, asking for help, but Dobby called, "Harry Potter is safe there, sir," and vanished. Then the Dursleys appeared, and Dudley rattled the bars of the cage, laughing at him. "Stop it," Harry muttered as the rattling pounded in his sore head. "Leave me alone. Cut it out. I'm trying to sleep." He opened his eyes. Moonlight was shining through the bars on the window, and someone was goggling through the bars at him. A freckle-faced, red-haired, long-nosed someone. Ron Weasley was outside Harry's window. End of chapter 2. Yeah, I mean, as said, the books have a lot more time to like set up the story. The movies move at a very fast pace. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people may only experience experience Harry Potter through the movies, and I think there's a lot of stuff missing, and I think that's why the reading's fun. Well, we've done 2 chapters so far, but I was gonna do 5 chapters. 5 or 6, maybe 5. So 3 more. We'll just feel it out. If the stream's too short, I might go longer. Chapter 3, The Burrow. "Ron," breathed Harry, creeping up to the window and pushing it up so they could talk through the bars. "Ron, how did you... what the..." Harry's mouth fell open as the full impact of what he was seeing hit him. Ron was leaning out of the back window of an old turquoise car which was parked in midair. Grinning at Harry from the front seats were Fred and George, Ron's elder twin brothers. "All right, Harry," asked George. "What's been going on?" said Ron. "Why haven't you been answering my letters? I asked you to stay about 12 times, and then Dad came home and said you've got an official warning from using magic in front of Muggles." "It wasn't me, and how did he know?" "He works for the Ministry," said Ron. "You know we're not supposed to use spells outside school." "You should talk," said Harry, staring at the floating car. "Oh, this doesn't count," said Ron. "We're only borrowing this. It's Dad's. We didn't enchant it. But doing magic in front of those Muggles you live with..." "I told you, I didn't, but it'll take too long to explain now. Look, can you tell them at Hogwarts that the Dursleys have locked me up and won't let me come back? And obviously I can't magic myself out because the Ministry will think that's the second spell I've done in 3 days, so..." "Stop gibbering," said Ron. "We've come to take you home with us." "But you can't magic me out either." "We don't need to," said Ron, jerking his head towards the front seat and grinning. "You forgot who I've got with me." "Tie that around the bars," said Fred, throwing the end of a rope to Harry. "If the Dursleys wake up, I'm dead," said Harry as he tied the rope tightly around a bar and Fred revved up the car. "Don't worry," said Fred, "and stand back." Harry moved back into the shadows next to Hedwig, who seemed to have realized how important this was and kept still and silent. The car revved louder and louder, and suddenly, with a crunching noise, the bars were pulled clean out of the window as Fred drove straight up in the air. Harry ran back to the window to see the bars dangling a few feet above the ground. Panting, Ron hoisted them up into the car. Harry listened anxiously, but there was no sound from the Dursleys' bedroom. When the bars were safely into the back seat with Ron, Fred reversed as close as possible to Harry's window. "Get in," said Ron. "But all my Hogwarts stuff, my wand, my broomstick, where is it? Locked in the cupboard under the stairs, and I can't get out of this room." "No problem," said George from the front passenger seat. "Out of the way, Harry." Fred and George climbed cat-like through the window into Harry's room. You had to hand it to them, thought Harry, as George took an ordinary hairpin from his pocket and started to pick the lock. A lot of wizards think it's a waste of time knowing this sort of muggle trick, said Fred, but we feel they're skills worth learning, even if they are a bit slow. There was a small click and the door swung open. So, we'll get your trunk, you grab anything you need from your room and hand it out to Ron, whispered George. Watch out for the bottom stair, it creaks, Harry whispered back as the twins disappeared onto the dark landing. Harry dashed around his room, collecting his things and passing them out of the window to Ron. Then he went to help Fred and George heave his trunk up the stairs. Harry heard Uncle Vernon cough. At last, panting, they reached the landing, then carried the trunk through Harry's room to the open window. Fred climbed back into the car to pull with Ron, and Harry and George pushed from the bedroom side. Inch by inch, the trunk slid through the window. Uncle Vernon coughed again. A bit more, panted Fred, who was pulling from inside the car. One good push. Harry and George threw their shoulders against the trunk, and it slid out of the window and into the back seat of the car. Okay, let's go, George whispered. But as Harry climbed onto the windowsill, there came a sudden loud screech from behind him, followed immediately by thunder of Uncle Vernon's voice. That ruddy owl! I've forgotten Hedwig! Harry tore back across the room as the landing light clicked on. He snatched up Hedwig's cage, dashed to the window, and passed it out to Ron. He was scrambling back onto the chest of drawers when Uncle Vernon hammered on the unlocked door, and it crashed open. For a split second, Uncle Vernon stood framed in the doorway. Then he let out a bellow like an angry bull and dived at Harry, grabbing him by the ankle. Ron, Fred, and George seized Harry's arms and pulled as hard as they could. Petunia! Roared Uncle Vernon. He's getting away! He's getting away! But the Weasleys gave a gigantic tug, and Harry's legs slid out of Uncle Vernon's grasp. Harry was in the car. He'd slammed the door shut. Put your foot down, Fred, yelled Ron, and the car shot suddenly toward the moon. Harry couldn't believe it. He was free. He rolled down the window, the night air whipping his hair, and looked back at the shrinking rooftops of Privet Drive. Uncle Vernon, Aunt Petunia, and Dudley were all hanging, dumbstruck, out of Harry's window. See you next summer, Harry called. The Weasleys roared with laughter, and Harry settled back into his seat, grinning from ear to ear. Let Hedwig out, he told Ron. She can fly behind us. She hasn't got a chance to stretch her wings for ages. George handed the hairpin to Ron, and, a moment later, Hedwig soared joyfully out of the window to glide alongside them like a ghost. So, what's the story, Harry? Said Ron impatiently. What's been happening? Harry told them all about Dobby, the warning he'd given Harry, and the fiasco of the violet pudding. There was a long, shocked silence when he had finished. Very fishy, said Ron finally. Definitely dodgy, agreed George. So, he wouldn't even tell you who's supposed to be plotting all this stuff? I don't think he could, said Harry. I told you, every time he got close to letting something slip, he started banging his head against the wall. He saw Fred and George look at each other. What, do you think he was lying to me? Said Harry. Well, said Fred, put it this way. House elves have got powerful magic of their own, but they can't usually use it without their master's permission. I reckon old Dobby was sent to stop you coming back to Hogwarts. Someone's idea of a joke. Can you think of anyone at school with a grudge against you? Yes, said Harry and Ron together, instantly. Draco Malfoy, Harry explained. He hates me. Draco Malfoy, said George, turning around. Not Lucius Malfoy's son. Must be. It's not a very common name, is it? Said Harry. Why? I've heard Dad talking about him, said George. He was a big supporter of you-know-who. And when you-know-who disappeared, said Fred, craning around to look at Harry, Lucius Malfoy came back, saying he'd never meant any of it. Loaded dong. Dad reckons he was right in you-know-who's inner circle. Harry had heard these rumors about Malfoy's family before, and they didn't surprise him at all. Malfoy made Dudley Dursley look like a kind, thoughtful, and sensitive boy. I don't know whether the Malfoys own a house elf, said Harry. Well, whoever owns him will be an old wizarding family, and they'll be rich, said Fred. Yeah, Mum's always wishing we had a house elf to do the ironing, said George. But all we've got is a lousy old ghoul in the attic and gnomes all over the garden. House elves come with big old manors and castles and places like that. You wouldn't catch one in our house. Harry was silent. Judging by the fact that Draco Malfoy usually had the best of everything, his family was rolling in wizard gold, he could just see Malfoy strutting around a large manor house. Sending the family servant to stop Harry from going back to Hogwarts also sounded exactly like the sort of thing Malfoy would do. Had Harry been stupid to take Dobby seriously? "I'm glad we came to get you anyway," said Ron. "I was getting really worried when you didn't answer any of my letters. I thought it was Errol's fault at first." "Who's Errol?" "Our owl. He's ancient. It wouldn't be the first time he's collapsed on a delivery. So then I tried to borrow Hermes." "Who?" "The owl Mom and Dad bought Percy when he was made prefect," said Fred from the front. "But Percy wouldn't lend him to me," said Ron. "Said he needed him." "Percy's been acting very oddly this summer," said George, frowning. "And he has been sending a lot of letters and spending a lot of time shut up in his room. I mean, there's only so many times you can polish a prefect badge. You're driving too far west, Fred," he added, pointing at a compass on the dashboard. Fred twiddled the steering wheel. "So, does your dad know you've got the car?" said Harry, guessing the answer. No," said Ron. "He had to work tonight. Hopefully we'll be able to get it back in the garage without Mom noticing we flew it." "What does your dad do at the Ministry of Magic, anyway?" "He works in the most boring department," said Ron. "The Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office." "The what?" "It's all to do with bewitching things that are Muggle-made, you know, in case they end up back in a Muggle shop or house. Like last year, some old witch died and her tea set was sold to an antique shop. This Muggle woman bought it, took it home, and tried to serve her friends tea in it. It was a nightmare. Dad was working overtime for weeks. What happened? The teapot went berserk and squirted boiling tea all over the place, and one man ended up in the hospital with the sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office, and they had to do memory charms and all sorts of stuff to cover it up. But your dad, this car," Fred laughed. "Yeah, Dad's crazy about everything to do with Muggles. Our shed's full of Muggle stuff. He takes it apart and puts spells on it and puts it back together again. If he raided our house, he'd have to put himself under arrest. It drives Mom mad." "That's the main road," said George, peering down through the windshield. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. Just as well, it's getting light." A faint pinkish glow was visible along the horizon to the east. Fred brought the car lower, and Harry saw a dark patchwork of fields and clumps of trees. "We're a little way outside the village," said George. "Ottery St. Catchpole." Lower and lower went the flying car. The edge of a brilliant red sun was now gleaming through the trees. "Touchdown," said Fred, and with a slight bump they hit the ground. They had landed next to a tumble-down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron's house. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pig pen, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high, and so crooked it looks as though it was held up by magic, which, Harry reminded himself, it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read, "The Burrow." Around the front door lay a jumble of rubber boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking around their yard. "It's not much," said Ron. "It's wonderful," said Harry, happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. "Now, we'll go upstairs really quietly," said Fred, "and wait for Mom to call us for breakfast. Then, Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, 'Mom, look who turned up in the night,' and she'll be all pleased to see Harry, and no one need ever know we flew the car." "Right," said Ron. "Come on, Harry. I sleep at the top." Ron had gone a very nasty greenish color, his eyes fixed on the house. The other 3 wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. "Ah," said Fred. "Oh dear," said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her eyes at her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of her pocket. "So," she said, "Morning, Mom," said George, in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. "Have you any idea how worried I've been?" said Mrs. Weasley in a deathly whisper. "Sorry, Mom, but see, we had to—" All three of Mrs. Weasley's sons were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. "Bed's empty, no note, car gone, could have crashed, out of my mind with worry. Did you care? Never, as long as I've lived. You wait till your father gets home. We've never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy." "Perfect Percy," muttered Fred. "You can do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book," yelled Mrs. Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. "You could have died. You could have been seen. You could have lost your father his job." It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on Harry, who backed away. "I'm very pleased to see you, Harry dear," she said. "Come in and have some breakfast." She turned to walk back into the house, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down on the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard house before. The clock on the wall opposite him had only one hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like, "Time to make tea," "Time to feed the chickens," and "You're late." Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece, books with titles like "Charm Your Own Cheese," "Enchantment in Baking," and "1-Minute Feasts, It's Magic." And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with the popular singing sorceress, Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around, cooking breakfast a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, "Don't know what you were thinking of," and "Never would have believed it." "I don't blame you, dear," she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto his plate. "Arthur and I have been worried about you, too. Just last night we were saying we'd come and get you out ourselves if you hadn't ridden back to Ron by Friday. But really," she was now adding 3 fried eggs to his plate. "Flying in a legal car halfway across the country. Anyone could have seen you." She flicked her wand casually at the dishes in the sink, which began to clean themselves, clinking gently in the background. "It was cloudy, Mom," said Fred. "You keep your mouth closed while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley snapped. "They were starving him, Mom," said George. "And you," said Mrs. Weasley, but it was with a slightly softened expression that she started cutting Harry's bread and buttering it for him. At that moment, there was a diversion in the form of a small, red-headed figure in a long nightdress who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. "Jenny," said Ron in an undertone to Harry, "my sister. She's been talking about you all summer." "Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry," Fred said with a grin, but he caught his mother's eye and bent his face over a plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. "Blimey, I'm tired," yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. "I think I'll go to bed and—" "You will not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's your own fault you've been up all night. You're going to de-gnome the garden for me. They're getting completely out of hand again." "Oh, Mom." "And you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "You can go up to bed, dear," she added to Harry. "You didn't ask them to fly that wretched car." But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, "I'll help Ron. I've never seen a de-gnoming." "That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's dull work," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, let's see what Lockhart's got to say on the subject." And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. "Mom, we know how to de-gnome a garden." Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Written across it in fancy gold letters were the words, "Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests." There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he is marvelous," she said. "He knows his household pests, all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mum fancies him," said Fred, in a fairly audible whisper. Don't be so ridiculous, Fred, said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go on and get it done with, and woe beride you if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect it. Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind him. The garden was large, and in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeds, and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the halls, plants Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a big green pond full of frogs. Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know, Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. Yeah, I've seen those things they think are gnomes, said Ron, bent double with his head on a peony bench, like fat little Santa Clauses with fishing rods. There was a violent scuffling noise. The peony bush shuddered, and Ron straightened up. This is a gnome, he said grimly. Groff me, squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Santa Claus. It was small and leathery looking, with large, knobby, bald head exactly like a potato. Ron held it at arm's length, and it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. This is what you have to do, he said. He raised the gnome above his head, off me, and started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing the shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, It doesn't hurt them. You've got to make them really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes. He let go of the gnome's ankles. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. Pitiful, said Fred. I bet I can get mine beyond that stump. Harry learned quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. He decided to just drop the first one he caught over the hedge, but the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard time shaking it off until... Wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet. The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. See, they're not too bright, said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at once. The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. You'd think they'd have learned now just to stay put. Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. They'll be back, said Ron as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny. Just then, the front door slammed. He's back, said George. Dad's home. They hurried through the garden and back into the house. Mr. Weasley was slumped in a kitchen chair with his glasses off and his eyes closed. He was a thin man, going bald, but the little hair he had left was as red as any of his children. He was wearing long green robes, which were dusty and travel-worn. What a night, he mumbled, groping for the teapot as they all sat down around him. 9 raids, 9. And old Mundungus Fletcher tried to put a hex on me when I had my back turned. Mr. Weasley took a long gulp of tea and sighed. Find anything, Dad? Said Fred eagerly. All I got were a few shrinking door keys and a biting kettle, yawned Mr. Weasley. There was some pretty nasty stuff that wasn't my department, though. Mortlake was taken away for questioning about some extremely odd ferrets, but that's the Committee on Experimental Charms, thank goodness. Why would anyone bother making door keys shrink, said George. Just muggle baiting, sighed Mr. Weasley. Sell them a key that keeps shrinking to nothing so they can never find it when they need it. Of course, it's very hard to convict anyone because no muggle would admit the key keeps shrinking. They'll insist they just keep losing it. Bless them. They'll go to any lengths to ignore magic, even if it's staring them in the face. But the things our lot have taken to enchanting, you wouldn't believe. Like cars, for instance. Mrs. Weasley had appeared, holding a long poker like a sword. Mr. Weasley's eyes jerked open. He stared guiltily at his wife. Cars, Smolly dear. Yes, Arthur, cars, said Mrs. Weasley, her eyes flashing. Imagine a wizard buying a rusty old car and telling his wife all he wanted to do with it was take it apart and see how it worked. Well, really, he was enchanting it to make it fly. Mr. Weasley blinked. Well, dear, I think you'll find he'd be quite within the law to do that, even if, he maybe would have done better to, tell his wife the truth. There's a loophole in the law, you'll find. As long as he wasn't intending to fly the car, the fact the car could fly wouldn't... Arthur Weasley, you made sure there was a loophole when you wrote that law, shouted Mrs. Weasley. Just so you could carry on tinkering with all that muggle rubbish in your shed. And for your information, Harry arrived this morning in the car you weren't intending to fly. Harry, said Mr. Weasley blankly. Harry who? He looked around, saw Harry, and jumped. Good Lord, is it Harry Potter? Very pleased to meet you. Ron's told us so much about. Your sons flew that car to Harry's house and back last night, shouted Mrs. Weasley. What have you got to say about that, eh? Did you really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Did it go all right? I mean, he faltered as sparks flew from Mrs. Weasley's eyes. That was very wrong, boys. Very wrong indeed. Let's leave them to it, Ron muttered to Harry as Mrs. Weasley swelled like a bullfrog. Come on, I'll show you my bedroom. They slipped out of the kitchen and down the narrow passageway to an uneven staircase, which wound its way up, zigzagging through the house. On the third landing, a door stood ajar. Harry just caught sight of a spell of bright brown eyes staring at him before it closed with a snap. Ginny, said Ron, you don't know how weird it is for her to be this shy. She never shuts up normally. They climbed 2 more flights until they reached a room with peeling paint and a soft plaque on it saying Ronald's room. Harry stepped in, his head almost touching the sloping ceiling, and blinked. It was like walking into a furnace. Nearly everything in Ron's room seemed to be a violent shade of orange. His bedspread, the walls, even the ceiling. Then Harry realized that Ron had covered nearly every inch of the shabby wallpaper with posters of the same 7 witches and wizards, all wearing bright orange robes, carrying broomsticks, and waving energetically. Your Quidditch team, said Harry. The Chudley Cannons, said Ron, pointing at the orange bedspread, which was emblazoned with 2 black giant C's and a speeding cannonball. 9th in the league. Ron's school spellbooks were stacked untidily in a corner, next to a pile of comics that all seemed to feature the adventures of Martin Miggs, the Mad Muggle. Ron's magic wand was lying on top of a fish tank full of frog spawn on the windowsill, next to his fat gray rat Scabbers, who was snoozing in a patch of sun. Harry stepped over a pack of self-shuffling playing cards on the floor and looked out the tiny window. In the field far below, he could see a gang of gnomes sneaking one by one back through the Weasley's hedge. Then he turned to Ron, who was watching him almost nervously, as though waiting for his opinion. It's a bit small, said Ron quickly. Not like that room you had with the muggles. And I'm right underneath the ghoul in the attic. He's always banging on the pipes and groaning. But Harry, grinning widely, said, This is the best house I've ever been in. Ron's ears went pink. End of chapter 3. Does anyone notice why they changed the look of Hogwarts after the second movie? I don't know the movies that well. I do remember the movies seem to feature this like in the books, I don't remember that like crazy staircase room where like there's staircases moving and talking portraits all in one giant like chamber. I don't know if that was really described in the book ever really. I mean, there's a lot of corridors and stairways, but that depiction in the movie seems to not really be in the books. So that was something that caught my eye. I'm not very familiar with the movies, as I said. Yeah, I mean, it might be interesting to glance the movies again and see. But, let's start chapter 4. I'll either do 5 or 6 chapters. Like, I could do, like, this book is 18 chapters, so if I did 6 chapters a day, then it would be done in 3 streams. Either that or could I do like 4 to 5 chapters a day and get it done in 4 streams? Something like that. I'll just see how I feel after chapter 5, I guess. Because I definitely want to do at least 5. Anyway, this is chapter 4 at Flourish and Blotts. Chapter 4 at Flourish and Blotts. Life at the burrow was as different as possible from life on Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Tuck your shirt in, Scruffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everyone there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4 helpings of every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table, so that he could bombard him with questions about life with Muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and the postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say, as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious, really, how many ways Muggles have found of getting along without magic." Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after he had arrived at the burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered a room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellowish parchment addressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You two have got them too," he added, as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was a silence as they all read their letters. Harry told them to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September 1st. There's also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, by Miranda Goshawk. Break with the Banshee, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Gadding with Ghouls, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Holidays with Hags, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Travels with Trolls, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Voyages with Vampires, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Wandering with Werewolves, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Year with the Yeti, by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eye and quickly busied himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George, with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things secondhand." "Oh, are you starting at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blooding to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his sweater vest. "Morning all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leapt up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molting gray feather duster. At least that's what Harry thought it was, until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp owl from Percy and extracting a letter from under its wing. "Finally, he's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try to rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. "Dear Ron, and Harry if you're there, I hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry is alright, would you please let me know at once? But perhaps it would be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course. How can she be, said Ron in horror. We're on vacation. And we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione. Well, that fits in nicely. We can all go and get your things then too, said Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. What are you all up to today? Harry, Ron, Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small paddock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from a view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there, as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they'd escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for one another to catch. They took turns riding Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he said he was busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtimes so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. Wish I knew what he was up to, said Fred, frowning. He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did. 12 owls, and he's hardly gloated at all. Ordinary wizarding levels, George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and his next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt working for the Wizards' Bank Gringotts. Don't know how Mom and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year, said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything. Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents had left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had money. You couldn't use galleons, sickles, and knuts in muggle shops. He had never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think the horror of anything connected with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. He didn't think their horror of anything. Yeah, okay. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday. After a quick half-dozen bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats, and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. We're running low, Arthur, she sighed. We'll have to buy some more today. Ah well, guess first. After you, Harry dear. And she offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them, all watching him. What am I supposed to do? He stammered. He's never traveled by Floo powder, said Ron suddenly. Sorry, Harry, I forgot. Never, said Mr. Weasley. But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year? I went on the underground. Really, said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Were there escapadors? How exactly? Not now, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me, if you've never used it before. He'll be all right, Mom, said Fred. Harry, watch us first. He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up to the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted, Diagon Alley, and vanished. You must speak clearly, dear, Mrs. Weasley told Harry as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. And be sure to get out at the right grate. The right what? Said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know, but as long as you've spoken clearly. He'll be fine, Molly, don't fuss, said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to the Floo powder too. But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain to his aunt and uncle? They wouldn't mind, Harry reassured her. Dudley would think it's a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that. Well, all right. You go after Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley. Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And keep your elbows tucked in, Ron advised, and your eyes shut, said Mrs. Weasley. The soot. Don't fidget, said Ron, or you might as well fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George. Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of flue powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. Diagonally, he coughed. It felt as though he was being sucked down a giant drain. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through his glasses, he saw a blurred scream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of the rooms beyond. His bacon sandwiches were churning inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop, and then his face fell forward onto stone cold and felt the bridge of his glasses snap. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses up to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in a stone fireplace that looked like a large, dimly lit wizard shop. But nothing in here was ever likely to be on a Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby held a withered hand on a cushion, a blood-stained pack of cards, and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks stared down from the walls. An assortment of human bones lay upon the counter, and rusty, spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry could see through the dusty shop window was definitely not Diagon Alley. The sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging from where it had hit the hearth, Harry made his way swiftly and silently toward the door. But before he got halfway toward it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass, and one of them was the very last person Harry ever wanted to meet when he was lost, covered in soot and wearing broken glasses. Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside it and pulled the doors closed, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man who followed could only be Draco's father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold, gray eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at items on display, and rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." "I said I would buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not on the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got a Nimbus 2000 last year. Special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous. Famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart. Wonderful Potter with a scar and his broomstick." "You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy, with a quelling look at his son. "And I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter, not when most of our kind regard him as the hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin." A stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair back from his face. "Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again," said Mr. Borgin in a voice as oily as his hair. "Delighted. And young Master Malfoy too. Charmed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you, just in today, and very reasonably priced." "I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling," said Mr. Malfoy. "Selling?" The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. "You have heard, of course, that the Ministry is conducting more raids," said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unraveling it for Mr. Borgin to read. "I have a few, items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call." Mr. Borgin fixed a pair of pince-nez to his nose and looked down at the list. The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surely. Mr. Malfoy's lip curled. I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect, yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumors about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt that flea-bitten, Muggle-loving fool Arthur Weasley is behind it. Harry felt a great surge of anger. As you see, certain of these poisons might make it appear... I understand, sir, of course, said Mr. Borgin. Let me see. Can I have that? Interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. Ah, the Hand of Glory, said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. Insert a candle, and it gives light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers. Your son has fine taste, sir. I hope my son will amount to more than a thief or a plunderer, Borgin, said Mr. Malfoy coldly. And Mr. Borgin said quickly, No offense, sir, no offense meant. Though if his grades don't pick up, said Mr. Malfoy, more coldly still, that may indeed be all he is fit for. It is not my fault, retorted Draco. The teachers have all have favorites, that Hermione Granger. I would have thought you'd been ashamed that a girl of no wizard family beat you in every exam, snapped Mr. Malfoy. Ha, said Harry under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both abashed and angry. It's the same all over, said Mr. Borgin in his oily voice. Wizard blood is counting for less everywhere. Not with me, said Mr. Malfoy, his long nostrils flaring. No, sir, nor with me, sir, said Mr. Borgin with a deep bow. In that case, perhaps we can return to my list, said Mr. Malfoy shortly. I am in something of a hurry, Borgin. I have important business elsewhere today. They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew nearer and nearer to his hiding place, examining the objects for sale. Draco paused to examine a long coil of hangman's rope to read, smirking, the card propped on a magnificent necklace of opals. Caution, do not touch, cursed, has claimed the lives of 19 Muggle owners to date. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He stretched out his hand for the handle. Done, said Mr. Malfoy at the counter. Come, Draco. Harry wiped his forehead on his sleeve as Draco turned away. Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I expect you at the manor tomorrow to pick up the goods. The moment the door had closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manner. Good day to yourself, Mr. Malfoy, and if the stories are true, you haven't sold me half of what's hidden in your manor. Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared into a back room. Harry waited for a minute in case he came back, then, quietly as he could, slipped out of the cabinet, past the glass cases, and out the shop door. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, Harry stared around. He had emerged into a dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up of shops entirely devoted to the dark arts. The one he'd just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down, a large cage was alive with gigantic black spiders. 2 shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadow of a doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight and hoping against hope he'd be able to find a way out of here. An old wooden street sign hanging over a shop selling poisonous candles told him he was in Nocturne Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough from his mouth full of ashes back in the Weasleys' fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. Not lost, are you, my dear? Said a voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingernails. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. I'm fine, thanks, he said. I'm just... Harry, what do you think you're doing down there? Harry's heart leapt. So did the witch. A load of fingernails cascaded down over her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding toward them, beetle-black eyes flashing over his great, bristling beard. Hagrid, Harry croaked in relief. I was lost. Flue powder. Hagrid seized Harry by the scruff of the neck and pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyway out into bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance, Gringotts Bank. Hagrid had steered him right back into Diagon Alley. You're a mess, said Hagrid gruffly, brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside an apothecary. Skulking around Nocturne Alley. I don't know. Dodgy place, Harry. Don't want no one to see you there. I realize that, said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made to brush him off again. I told you, I was lost. What were you doing there anyway? I was looking for a flesh-eaten slug repellent, growled Hagrid. They're ruining the school cabbages. You're not on your own. I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated, Harry explained. I've got to go find them. They set off together down the street. How come you never wrote back to me, said Hagrid, as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. Lousy muggles, growled Hagrid. If I'd have known. Harry, over here. Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing at the top of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her bushy brown hair flying behind her. What happened to your glasses? Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry? As soon as I've found the Weasleys, said Harry. You won't have long to wait, said Hagrid with a grin. Harry and Hermione turned around, sprinting up the crowded street were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. Harry, Mr. Weasley panted. We'd hoped you'd only gone one grade too far. He mopped his glistening bald patch. Molly's frantic. She's coming now. Where did you come out? Ron asked. Nocturne Alley, said Hagrid grimly. Excellent, said Fred and George together. We've never been allowed in, said Ron enviously. I should ruddy well think not, growled Hagrid. Mrs. Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging wildly in one hand, Ginny just clinging onto the other. Oh, Harry, oh, my dear, you could have been anywhere. Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot Hagrid hadn't managed to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap of his wand, and returned them, good as new. Well, gotta be off, said Hagrid, who was having his hand wrung by Mrs. Weasley. Nocturne Alley, if you hadn't found him, Hagrid. See her at Hogwarts, and he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed street. Guess who I saw in Borgin and Burke's? Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. Malfoy and his father. Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything? Said Mr. Weasley sharply behind him. No, he was selling. So he's worried, said Mr. Weasley with grim satisfaction. Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something. You be careful, Arthur, said Mrs. Weasley sharply as they were bowed into the bank by a goblin at the door. That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew. So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy, said Mr. Weasley indignantly, but he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. But you're muggles, said Mr. Weasley delightedly. We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look. He pointed excitingly at the 10-pound notes in Mr. Granger's hand. Meet you back here, Ron said to Hermione as the Weasleys and Harry were led off to their underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin. The vaults were reached by means of small, goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks throughout the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Nocturne Alley when it was opened. There was a very small pile of silver sickles inside and just one gold galleon. Mrs. Weasley felt right into the corners before sweeping the whole bag into her lot. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view as he hastily shoved a handful of coins into a leather bag. Back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had spotted their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Mrs. Weasley and Ginny were going to a second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll all meet at Flourish and Blotts in an hour to buy your school books," said Mrs. Weasley, setting off with Ginny. "And not one step down Nocturne Alley," she shouted as the twins retreating backs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding, cobbled street. The bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pocket was clamoring to be spent, so he bought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley, examining the fascinating shop windows. Ron gazed longingly at a full set of Chudley Cannon's robes and the windows of quality Quidditch supplies, until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door. In Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke Shop, they met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Filibuster's fabulous wet start, no-heat fireworks. And in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, lopsided brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy, deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gained Power. A study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers, Ron read aloud off the back cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. "Of course, he's very ambitious, Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be Minister of Magic," Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone as they left Percy to it. An hour later, they headed for Flourish and Blotts. They were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshop. As they approached it, they saw, to their surprise, a large crowd jostling outside the doors trying to get in. The reason for this was proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. Gilderoy Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography, Magical Me, today, 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. "We can actually meet him," Hermione squealed. "I mean, he's written almost the whole book list." The crowd seemed to be made up of mostly witches around Mrs. Weasley's age. A harassed-looking wizard stood at the door, saying, "Calmly, please, ladies, don't push. There, mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside. A long line wound right around to the back of the shop, where Gilderoy Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing, along with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are, good," said Mrs. Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzlingly white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue that exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, irritable-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This is for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Gilderoy Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be Harry Potter!" The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand for the photographer, who was clicking away madly, wafting thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice big smile, Harry," said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm around his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, wavering for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is. The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time. When young Harry here stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now, free of charge." The crowd applauded again. "He had no idea," Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, "that he would be shortly getting much, much more than my book, Magical Me. He and his schoolmates will, in fact, be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I will be taking up the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire works of Gilderoy Lockhart. Staggering slightly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight and to the edge of the room, where Ginny was standing next to her new cauldron. "You have these," Harry muttered to her, tipping the books into her cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was wearing his usual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, eh?" "Not as surprised I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all these." Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron too, and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George. "What are you doing? It's too crowded in here. Let's go outside." Well, well, well. Arthur Weasley. It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, sneering in just the same way. Lucius, said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Ginny's cauldron and extracted, from amid the glossy Lockhart books, a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," Mr. Malfoy said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. "The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink to no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him back towards the bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backward, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, and then louder than them all, "Break it up, gents. There, break it up." Hagrid was wading toward them through the sea of books. In an instant he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core, the whole family, everyone knows that. No, Malfoy's worth listening to her. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. A fine example to set for your children, brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought. He was pleased, said Fred. Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity. But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireplace in the leaky cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shopping would be traveling back to the burrow using flue powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to flue powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. End of chapter 4. You read somewhere that King's Cross was a mistake. Author was thinking it was Saint. I don't know. I don't know anything about that. He stayed through all of August. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Like a month or more with the Weasleys. Is there only one prefect per house? I don't know, actually. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think you have to be 5th year to become a prefect. Something like that. And I don't know if there's only one. Yeah, I mean, I hope it's enjoyable, and I hope it brings something good for someone out there. Thank you, ISO. The chemical burn scene from Fight Club. I forgot what an unlikable character Lockhart was. Yeah, I think Lockhart is well, it gets no spoilers, but like it keeps evolving. All right, let's jump forward to chapter 5 here. Chapter 5, The Whomping Willow. The end of summer vacation came too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but his month at the Burrow had been the happiest of his life. It was difficult not to feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he could expect next time he turned up on Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a sumptuous dinner that included all of Harry's favorite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks. They had filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall for at least half an hour. Then it was time for a last mug of hot chocolate and bed. It took a while to get started next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they all seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half-dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck, tripping over a stray chicken as he crossed the yard, carrying Ginny's trunk to the car. Harry couldn't see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, 2 owls, and a rat were going to fit into one small Ford Anglia. He had reckoned, of course, without special features that Mr. Weasley had added. Not a word to Molly, he whispered to Harry as he opened the trunk and showed him how it had been magically expanded so that their luggage fitted easily. When at last they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, Muggles do know more than we give them credit for, don't they? She and Ginny got into the front seat, which had been stretched so it resembled a park bench. I mean, you'd never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you? Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Harry turning back for a last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he'd see it again when they were back. George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run up for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked that she'd left her diary. By the time she clambered back into the car, they were running very late, and tempers were running high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Molly, dear. No, Arthur. No one would see. This little button here is an invisibility booster I installed. That'd get us up in the air, and then we'd fly above the clouds. We'd be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be any wiser." "I said no, Arthur, not in broad daylight." They reached King's Cross at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get trolleys for their trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry had caught the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky part was getting onto platform 9 3/4, which wasn't visible to the Muggle eye. What you had to do was walk through the solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so that none of the Muggles noticed you vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed they only had 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy rode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. "I'll take Ginny, and you two come right after us," Mrs. Weasley told Harry and Ron, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. "Let's go together. We've only got a minute," Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure Hedwig's cage was safely wedged on top of his trunk and wheeled his trolley around to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident. This wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using flue powder. Both of them bent low over the handles of their trolleys and walked purposefully towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet from it, they broke into a run and... crash! Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backward. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thump, and Harry was knocked off his feet, and Hedwig's cage bounced onto the shiny floor, and she rolled away, shrieking indignantly. People all around them stared, and a guard nearby yelled, "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" "Lost control of the trolley," Harry gasped, clutching his ribs as he got up. Ron ran to pick up Hedwig, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty to animals from the surrounding crowd. "Why can't we get through?" Harry hissed to Ron. "I don't know." Ron looked wildly around. A dozen curious people were still watching them. "We're gonna miss this train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself." Harry looked up at the giant clock, and with a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach, 10 seconds, 9 seconds, he wheeled his trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. "It's gone," said Ron, sounding stunned. "The train's left. What if Mom and Dad can't get back through to us? Have you got any Muggle money?" Harry gave a hollow laugh. "The Dursleys haven't given me pocket money for about 6 years. Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. "Can't hear a thing," he said tensely. "What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get back to us." They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of Hedwig's continuing screeches. "I think we'd better go wait by the car," said Harry. "We're attracting too much attention." "Harry," said Ron, his eyes gleaming. "The car. What about it? We can fly the car to Hogwarts." "But I thought... We're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency. Section 19 or something of the restriction of thingy." "But your mom and dad," said Harry, pushing against the barrier again in the vain hope that it would give away. "How will they get home?" "They don't need the car," said Ron impatiently. "They know how to apparate, just vanish and reappear at home. They only bother with flue powder in the car because we're all underage and we're not allowed to apparate yet." Harry's feeling of panic suddenly turned to excitement. "Can you fly it?" No problem, said Ron, wheeling his trolley around to face the exit. Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express. And they marched off through the crowd of curious muggles, out the station, and back out onto the side road where the old Ford Anglia was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk with a series of taps from his wand. They heaved their luggage back in, put Hedwig on the back seat, and got into the front. Check that no one's watching, said Ron, starting the ignition with another tap of his wand. Harry stuck his head out the window. Traffic was rumbling along the main road ahead, but their street was empty. Okay, he said. Ron pressed a silver tiny button on the dashboard. The car around them vanished, and so did they. Harry could feel the seat vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel his hands on his knees and his glasses on his nose, but for all he could see, he had become a pair of eyeballs floating a few feet above the ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. Let's go, said Ron's voice from his right. And the ground and the dirty buildings on either side fell away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole of London lay, smoky and glittering, below them. Then there was a popping noise, and the car, Harry, and Ron reappeared. Uh-oh, said Ron, jabbing at the invisibility booster. It's faulty. Both of them pummeled it. The car vanished, then it flickered back on again. Hold on, Ron yelled, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. They shot straight into the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. Now what? Said Harry, blinking at the solid mass of cloud, pressing in on them from all sides. We need to see the train to know which direction to go in, said Ron. Dip back down again, slowly. They dropped back beneath the clouds and twisted around in their seats, squinting at the ground. I can see it, Harry yelled. Right ahead, there. The Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet snake. Due north, said Ron, checking the compass on their dashboard. Okay, we'll just have to check it out every half hour or so. Hold on. And they shot up through the clouds. A minute later, they burst out into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the cars skimmed the sea of fluffy cloud, the sky a bright, endless blue under the blinding white sun. All we've got to worry about now are airplanes, said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time, they couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plunged into a fabulous dream. This, thought Harry, was surely the only way to travel. Past swirls and turrets of snowy cloud, in a car full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartment, and the prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous faces when they landed smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn in front of Hogwarts Castle. They made regular checks on the train as they flew farther and farther north, each dip beneath the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, replaced by neat green fields that gave way in turn to wide purplish moors, a great city alive with cars like multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made him extremely thirsty, and he had nothing to drink. He and Ron pulled off their sweaters, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of his seat, and his glasses kept sliding down to the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now, and was thinking longingly of the train miles below, where you could buy ice-cold pumpkin juice from a trolley pushed by a plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get into platform 9 3/4? Can't be much further, can it? Croaked Ron, hours later still, as the sun started to sink into their floor of clouds, staining it a deep pink. Ready for another check on the train. It was still right below them, winding its way past a snow-capped mountain. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove them upward again, but as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. It's probably just tired, said Ron. It's never been this far before. And they both pretended not to notice the whining growing louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker. Stars were blossoming in the darkness. Harry pulled his sweater back on, trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers were now waving feebly as though in protest. "Not far," said Ron, more to the car than to Harry. "Not far now," and he patted the dashboard nervously. When they flew back beneath the clouds a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for a landmark they knew. "There!" Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedwig jump, straight ahead. Silhouetted on the dark horizon, high on the cliff over the lake, stood many turrets and towers of Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. "Come on," said Ron said cajolingly, giving the steering wheel a little shake. "Nearly there, come on." The engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from under the hood. Harry found himself gripping the edges of his seat very hard as they flew toward the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of his window, Harry saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. "Come on," Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clunk, a sputter, and the engine died completely. "Uh-oh," said Ron into the silence. The nose of the car dropped. They were falling, gathering speed, heading straight for the solid castle wall. "No!" Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned in a great arc, soaring over the dark greenhouses, then the vegetable patch, then out over the black lawns, losing altitude all the time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled his wand out of his back pocket. "Stop! Stop!" he yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield, but they were still plummeting, the ground flying up toward them. "Watch out for that tree!" Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crunch. With an ear-splitting bang of metal and wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing from under the crumpled hood. Hedwig was shrieking in terror. A golf ball-sized lump was throbbing on Harry's head where he had hit the windshield, and to his right, Ron let out a low, despairing groan. "Are you okay?" Harry said urgently. "My wand," said Ron in a shaky voice. "Look at my wand." It had snapped, almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held on by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure they'd be able to mend it up at the school, but he never even got started. At that very moment, something hit his side of the car with the force of a charging bull, sending him lurching sideways into Ron, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. "What's happened?" Ron gasped, staring through the windshield. Harry looked around just in time to see a branch as thick as a python smash into it. The tree they had hit was attacking them. Its trunk was bent almost double, and its gnarled bores were pummeling every inch of the car it could reach. "Arg," said Ron, as another twisted limb punched a large dent into his door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows from knuckle-like twigs, and a branch as thick as battering ram was pounding furiously on the roof, which seemed to be caving. "Run for it," Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against his door. But the next second he had been knocked backwards onto Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. "We're done for," he moaned as the ceiling sagged. But suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. "Reverse!" Harry yelled, and the car shot backwards. The tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roots creaking as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped out of reach. "That," panted Ron, "was close. Well done, car." The car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With two sharp clunks, the doors flew open, and Harry felt his seat tip aside sideways. Next thing he knew, he was sprawled on the damp ground. Loud thuds told him that the car was ejecting their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open. She rose out of it with an angry screech and sped off towards the castle without a backward look. Then, dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. "Come back," Ron yelled after it, brandishing his broken wand. "Dad'll kill me." But the car disappeared from view with one last snort from its exhaust. Can you believe our luck? Said Ron miserably, bending down to pick up Scabbers. Of all the trees we could have hit, we had to get the one that hits back. He glanced over his shoulder at the ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. Come on, said Harry wearily. We better get up to school. It wasn't at all the triumphant arrival they had pictured. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized the end of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope toward the great oak front doors. I think the feast's already started, said Ron, dropping his trunk at the front of the dropping his trunk at the foot of the front steps and crossing quietly to look through a brightly lit window. Hey, Harry, come and look. It's the sorting. Harry hurried over, and together he and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in midair over 4 long, crowded tables, making the golden plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitched ceiling, which always mirrored the sky outside, was sparkling with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hats, Harry saw a long line of scared-looking first-years filing into the hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on a stool before the newcomers. Every year, this aged-old hat, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted the new students into the 4 Hogwarts houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry well remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago, and waiting, petrified, for its decision as it muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds he had feared that the hat was going to put him in Slytherin, the house that had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other, but he had ended up in Gryffindor, along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron had helped Gryffindor win the house championship, beating Slytherin for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place the hat on his head. Harry's eyes wandered past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, sat watching the sorting from the staff table, his long silver beard and half-moon glasses shining brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Harry saw Gilderoy Lockhart dressed in robes of aquamarine, and there at the end was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. Hang on, Harry muttered to Ron. There's an empty chair at the staff table. Where's Snape? Professor Severus Snape was Harry's least favorite teacher. Harry also happened to be Snape's least favorite student. Cruel, sarcastic, and disliked by everyone except the students of his own house, Slytherin. Snape taught potions. Maybe he's ill, said Ron hopefully. Maybe he's left, because he missed out on the Defense Against the Dark Arts job again. Or he might have been sacked, said Ron enthusiastically. I mean, everyone hates him. Or maybe, said a very cold voice right behind them, he's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive on the school train. Harry spun around. There, his black robes rippling in a cold breeze, stood Severus Snape. He was a thin man with sallow skin, a hooked nose, and greasy, shoulder-length black hair, and at this moment he was smiling in a way that told Harry he and Ron were in very deep trouble. Follow me, said Snape. Not daring to even look at each other, Harry and Ron followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the warmth and light, down a narrow stone staircase that led into the dungeons. In, he said, opening a door halfway down the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars, in which floated all manner of revolting things Harry really didn't want to know the name of at the moment. The fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. So, he said softly, the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick, Weasley. Want to arrive with a bang, did we, boys? No, sir, it was the barrier at King's Cross. Silence, said Snape coldly. What have you done with the car? Ron gulped. This wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds. But a moment later, he understood, as Snape unrolled today's issue of the Evening Prophet. "You were seen," he hissed, showing them the headline. "Flying Forward Anglia mystifies Muggles." He began to read aloud. "Two Muggles in London, convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower at noon in Norfolk. Mrs. Hetty Bayliss, while hanging out her washing. Mr. Angus Fleet of Peebles reported to police. 6 or 7 Muggles in all. I believe your father works in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office," he said, looking up at Ron and smiling still more nastily. Dear, dear, his own son. Harry felt as though he'd just been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's larger branches. If anyone found out that Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. "I noticed in my search of the park that considerable damage seems to have been done to a very valuable Whomping Willow," Snape went on. "That tree did more damage to us than we," Ron blurted out. "Silence," snapped Snape again. "Most unfortunately, you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go and fetch the people who do have that happy power. You will wait here." Harry and Ron stared at each other, white-faced. Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. He now felt extremely sick. He tried to not look at a large, slimy something suspended in a green liquid on the shelf behind Snape's desk. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, they were hardly any better off. She might be fairer than Snape, but she was still extremely strict. 10 minutes later, Snape returned, and sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but either he had forgotten just how thin her mouth could go, or he had never seen her this angry before. She raised her wand from the moment she entered. Harry and Ron both flinched, but she merely pointed it at the empty fireplace, where flames suddenly erupted. "Sit," she said, and they both backed into chairs by the fire. "Explain," she said, her glasses glinting ominously. Ron launched into the story, starting with the barrier at the station refusing to let them through. "So we had no choice, Professor. We just couldn't get on the train." "Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl," Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. Harry gaped at her. Now she said it, it seemed the obvious thing to have done. I didn't think." "That," said Professor McGonagall, "is obvious." There was a knock on the door, and Snape, now looking happier than ever, opened it. There stood the headmaster, Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He stared down his very crooked nose at them, and Harry suddenly found himself wishing that he and Ron were still being beaten up by the Whomping Willow. There was a long silence. Then Professor Dumbledore said, "Please explain why you did this." It would have been better if he had shouted. Harry hated the disappointment in his voice, but for some reason he was unable to look Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his knees. He told Dumbledore everything, except that Mr. Weasley owned the bewitched car, making it sound as though he and Ron had happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see through this at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer at them through his spectacles. "We'll go and get our stuff," said Ron in a hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. "Not today, Mr. Weasley," said Dumbledore, "but I must impress upon both of you the seriousness of what you've done. I will be writing to both of your families tonight. I must also warn you that if you do anything like that again, I will have no choice but to expel you." Snape looked as though Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat and said, "Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flouted the decree for the restriction of underage wizardry, caused serious damage to an old and valuable tree. Surely acts of this nature—" "It will be for Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishments, Severus," said Dumbledore calmly. "They are in her house and are therefore her responsibility." He turned to Professor McGonagall. "I must go back to the feast, Minerva. I've got to give out a few notices. Come, Severus, there's a delicious-looking custard tart I want to sample. Snape shot a look of pure venom at Harry and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving them alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. You'd better get along to the hospital wing, Weasley. You're bleeding. Not much, said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with his sleeve. Professor, I wanted to watch my sister being sorted. The sorting ceremony is over, said Professor McGonagall. Your sister is also in Gryffindor. Oh, good, said Ron. And speaking of Gryffindor, Professor McGonagall said sharply, but Harry cut in. Professor, when we took the car, term hadn't started, so Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken from it, should it? He finished, watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but he was sure she had almost smiled. Her mouth looked less thin, anyway. I will not take any points from Gryffindor, she said, and Harry's heart lightened considerably. But you will both get a detention. It was better than Harry had expected. As for Dumbledore writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Harry knew perfectly well they'd just be disappointed that the Whomping Willow hadn't squashed him flat. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed it at Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches, 2 silver goblets, and a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. You will eat in here and then go straight up to your dormitory, she said. I must also return to the feast. When the door had closed behind her, Ron let out a long, low whistle. I thought we'd had it, he said, grabbing a sandwich. So did I, said Harry, taking one too. Can you believe our luck, though, said Ron thickly through a mouthful of chicken and ham. Fred and George must have flown the car 5 or 6 times, and no muggle ever saw them. He swallowed and took another large bite. Why couldn't we get through the barrier? Harry shrugged. We'll have to watch our step from now on, though, he said, taking a grateful swig of pumpkin juice. Wish we could have gone up to the feast. She didn't want us showing off, said Ron sagely. Doesn't want people to think it's clever, arriving by flying car. When they had eaten as many sandwiches as they could, the plate kept refilling itself, they rose and left the office, treading the familiar path to Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet. It seemed that the feast was over. They walked past muttering portraits and creaking suits of armor, and climbed narrow flights of stone stairs, until they at last reached the passage where the secret entrance to Gryffindor Tower was hidden, behind an oil painting of a very fat woman in a pink silk dress. Password, she said as they approached. Said Harry. They didn't know the New Year's password, not having met a Gryffindor prefect yet, but help came almost immediately. They heard hurrying feet behind them and turned to see Hermione dashing toward them. There you are! Where could you have been? The most ridiculous rumors. Someone said you'd been expelled for crashing a flying car. Well, we haven't been expelled, Harry assured her. You're not telling me you did fly here, said Hermione, the sound almost as severe as Professor McGonagall. Skip the lecture, said Ron impatiently, and tell us the new password. It's Wattlebird, said Hermione impatiently, but that's not the point. Her words were cut short, however, as the portrait of the fat lady swung open, and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole of Gryffindor House was still awake, packed into the circular common room, standing on the lopsided tables and squashy armchairs, waiting for them to arrive. Arms reached through the portrait hole to pull Harry and Ron inside, leaving Hermione to scramble in after them. Brilliant, yelled Lee Jordan. Inspired. What an entrance. Flying a car right into the Whomping Willow. People will be talking about that one for years. Good for you, said a fifth year Harry had never spoken to. Someone was patting him on the back as though he just won a marathon. Fred and George pushed their way to the front and said together, Why couldn't we have come in the car, eh? Ron was scarlet in the face, grinning embarrassedly, but Harry could see one person who didn't look happy at all. Percy was visible over the heads of some excited first years, and he seemed to be trying to get near enough to start telling them off. Harry nudged Ron in the ribs and nodded in Percy's direction. Ron got the point at once. Got to get upstairs, a bit tired, he said, and the two of them started pushing their way toward the door on the other side of the room, which led to a spiral staircase in the dormitories. Night, Harry called back to Hermione, who was wearing a scowl just like Percy's. They had managed to get to the other side of the common room, still having their backs slapped, and gained the piece of the staircase. They hurried up it, right to the top, and at last reached the door of their old dormitory, which now had a sign on it saying second years. They entered the familiar circular room with its 5 four-posters hung with red velvet and its high, narrow windows. Their trunks had been brought up for them and stood at the end of their beds. Ron grinned guiltily at Harry. I know I shouldn't have enjoyed that or anything, but the dormitory door flew open, and in came the other second-year Gryffindor boys. Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom. Unbelievable, beamed Seamus. Cool, said Dean. Amazing, said Neville, awestruck. Harry couldn't help it. He grinned too. Alright. That was 5 chapters. I feel, yeah, I might do 4 chapters tomorrow actually, and try to get it done in 4 readings instead of 3 readings. So I don't think I'll do another chapter today. Yeah, that was the longer chapter, it was. But anyway, that's all. I hope you enjoyed the reading, and there will be another one tomorrow. And that's pretty much it. So, alright. I'll just end it here, and I'll see you tomorrow.